Good evening, ladies and germs. So, somebody had just drawn my attention to the video that I did about Uncle Joe and the advice he gave me about people. Uh, if you haven't seen it, I think it's a good story. It's called, I think, The Simple Wisdom of Uncle Joe. Anyway, in that story, I had mentioned that about a story about when they were dating. And I said I would relay. So I'm going to do that. Now, just so you know, and a lot of now these place names won't mean a whole lot to anybody who's not from around here, and maybe even people who live nearby. But as I've said before, Uncle Joe and coincidentally the rest of my mother's family lived in Pen 5, and somehow Uncle Joe met who was to become Aunt Sophie, and she lived in a little area called Whiteside, which is outside of Houtsdale, which is maybe, well, if you go from Pen 5 to Whiteside, probably 7 miles or so. Doesn't seem like a big deal, except, back then it probably seemed farther, but luckily Uncle Joe had a car. Although if he had to walk, then it's probably only about 4 miles because he'd be able to cut cross country. But anyway, so Uncle Joe was dating Aunt Sophie. Now, Aunt Sophie's mother was known to one and all as BaBas. She was no blood relation to, my mother or any of us, but she was always known as BaBas. And, she had come over, in the, whatever they called it, third class, fourth class, whatever was cheapest. She came over from the old country, I think when she was just about 14 or so. But in the belly of a ocean liner, basically. But she came over, and I don't know a whole lot about her story, but although there's a cute story I know about her from a job that she had when she first came, and she didn't speak much English at the time, but that'll be something to throw in for another time. Anyway, so they lived up Whiteside, and the one night Uncle Joe went up to visit Aunt Sophie, and there was a fellow there visiting BaBas, and he was from the old country. And they were talking, they of course introduced, this is Sophie's fellow Joe, Olenoski. And the guy says, I was in the army with an Olenoski back in the old country. And I guess they discussed it a little bit, and it turned out that Uncle Joe's father, Marco Olenoski, is the same Olenoski this guy was in the army with. And so Uncle Joe called his father and said, hey, put your shoes on or whatever, I'm coming down to get you. And he came back down to Pen 5, picked his dad up and took him up there, and two old army buddies spent a couple hours there talking and reminiscing. And the thing that always got me about this story is the crazy coincidence of it all. Here's these two guys over there, and I say they're in the army. I don't even know. I don't know if they were in World War I or what. I think I I don't know if that, knowing that my mother was born in 23 and she was not the oldest child, I'd have to think my grandfather came over earlier than, 1918 to be able to come over and find a wife and have a couple kids by then. So I don't know, but just a coincidence that they were, by the way, if any of my older cousins or anybody watches this and they have no more details, do me a favor and throw them in the comments. Because I've never been exactly sure even what country they were in the army for. I always assumed my grandfather was cavalry just because he had an old cavalry sword, but maybe he just happened to have that sword. And he was supposed to be from Poland, but I seem to remember seeing or hearing something about the Russian army. But who knows about the way borders were back then, or maybe the Poles fought for the Russians. I just do not know. Anyway, let's get back to our story, would we? Quit interrupting me. So, like I said, the coincidence of these two guys immigrating from Russian, Poland, China, who the hell knows, and years later, the one son just happens to be dating the daughter of the guy who he was in the army with. That they both, and I think it wouldn't have been as big of a coincidence if, like, say, it was New York City. You could see like two immigrants coming and finding jobs in New York, and years later bumping into each other on the street. Hey, Marco. Hey, Stanislav. But to not only be Pennsylvania, but very small town, central Pennsylvania, it just is kind of astounding. And that story I thought of about Baba, this one hasn't been too long. Let me see if I can throw that in real quick. This was another one Aunt Sophie told me. She's the one that told me the dating story too. But apparently when her mother first came over, she got a job, and I think it was at the Waldorf. There was a guy who ran the kitchen who was a hunky, and he would hire other immigrants that came over. And Baba and another young girl were working there. Neither one of them really spoke much English. And the guy sent them up to the produce store to get some bananas. And this would have been way back around turn of the century. Again, I don't know, might have been before 1900. I don't know if that's possible. Anyway, maybe somebody else would know details about that. But anyway, it would have been early on. But here's these two little immigrant girls. And the guy says, go up there, tell the guy it's for me and that you want bananas. So they go up and they're walking up the street. And they're like, oh, look at that tall building there. Oh, look at the way these people are dressed. Oh, look, there's a horse-drawn carriage. I don't know. They're just looking at the sights and walk up, and they get to the produce guy, and they couldn't remember why the hell they were there. So they had to walk all the way back. And they asked the guy, what was that called again? He said, bananas. And they're like, okay, bananas. So now they're walking back up, and the whole way they're going, bananas, bananas, bananas. And I'm sure even New York City, even though it was New York City back then, people probably thought they were nuts walking up the street saying bananas, bananas, bananas. But anyway, they get back up there and they tell the guy who it's for and bananas. And he gives them, I imagine, being for a hotel restaurant, and the reason he probably sent two of them, they probably had, these big bunches of bananas to carry back. Well, of course, neither one of them, being poor immigrants from Europe, had never seen a banana in their life. So they thought, let's taste one and see what these are. So they grab a banana and bite into it like an apple, right through the skin. They're like, oh, God, this tastes awful. Americans are crazy if they like this stuff. And, later on, of course, they found out the right way to eat bananas and maybe even tangerines. But I just thought that was a cute little story. And so that's another little thing somewhat about Uncle Joe and Aunt Sophie, more about my grandfather and Baba, and a little bit about Baba before she was even thought of becoming a Baba. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.